So it's my great delight to introduce our first speaker today, who I saw in action up in Glasgow, valiantly manning a stall in the Green Zone. Peter Lefort runs the University of Exeter's Green Futures Network, connecting communities and organisations to the latest environmental research and resources. He was attending COP26 to support the university's 27 events across the blue, green and fringe zones, aiming to inform and engage with world leaders, international organisations and climate activists. He's previously worked for Cornwall Council's Carbon Neutral Cornwall programme, the Eden Project, the Community Action Group Network in Oxfordshire, and People and Planet. He's also on the steering group for the Happy Museum project and is a co-chair of Transition Network. He's going to talk about what happened and what didn't happen at COP26, as well as reflect on the UK government's net zero strategy, what we need to know about that. And then he's got a question for your contemplation afterwards. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Rob. That's a lovely introduction and lovely to see you all. So yes, as Rob said, I'm going to talk for a little bit about my perspective on COP from what I saw and what I was involved in, but also in discussion with many of the academics I was there with from the University of Exeter. So I'm going to talk about some of the key themes that I think are emerging and the things that are useful to hold on to. I'm not going to try and put a positive spin on COP, but I'm going to talk about, well, what are the things we can latch onto and move forward with. So if you bear with me, I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few slides to talk through. So as Rob said, this is what I'm going to discuss, COP26, but also the UK government's net zero strategy. So this is a little bit more detailed about what the UK government is going to do. So this is their first plan of how they're going to meet their ambitions. I know there are a few people on the call who aren't from the UK, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I think this is a useful thing to look at alongside COP itself. The first thing I want to look at is the bigger picture. Okay, so if we want to ask the question, what happened at COP, it's useful to think about, well, what has happened since previous COPs and how do we notice that? So thinking back to Paris in 2015, what has happened since then? And there's quite a lot. So just a list of things we've had: innovation in clean technology, a lot more political resilience for climate emergency responses. The idea of 1.5 degrees has been normalized. The idea of net zero has been normalized. We've had a shift towards clean energy, significant institutional change, and a real growth of youth engagement and grassroots momentum. Now, this is not to say that all of those things were as a result of COP. There's been some huge pressure behind the scenes with activism since that time, but it is important to reflect on the world does change, and we will look back at one point at COP26 and think, well, how have things changed since then? One specific example is how the science has changed in terms of how that is accepted. If we think back to COP24, 2018, there was a concerted effort from some countries involved to keep the IPCC's report out of the official text of COP. Compare that to now, and it was front and center in the reports coming out of Glasgow. And this is echoed by many of the academics I was talking to at COP and was there with. There is a really increased acceptance of the science around climate change, and that is important to recognize and easy to underestimate. And lastly, in terms of big picture, fossil fuels, you might have heard a lot of language around fossil fuels as toxic assets, particularly coal. Here are a couple of quotes I think are interesting from Jennifer Morgan: "The era of coal is ending," and from the UK government's own press release, "The end of coal is in sight." Now, obviously, there's a huge gap between these words being said and these things happening, but I think it is important to reflect on these things being said by people who haven't said these things before. And these are the kinds of things we have to latch onto and kind of build our movement on to recognize how things are changing. Now, to talk about specific changes, 1.5 degrees. So one of the kind of the sound bites out of COP was aiming to keep 1.5 alive. You know, can we come out of COP26 with a clear idea of whether or not we're going to be able to meet that particular target? A lot of the science suggests that that's not where we're on course to go. And this is a graph from the excellent carbon brief looking at, okay, well, if we add up all of the commitments that were made last year, before COP this year, at COP this year and add in the various net zero promises made by various countries, this is what we are potentially on course to do. So you can see the most optimistic version of that is looking at 1.8 degrees. So way off that 1.5 idea. But this idea of 1.5 is a really important thing for us at a community level to think about what is our relationship to this number. Because as we've seen, it's really been normalized, and that's brought a lot of kind of positives in terms of campaigning and messaging. But we are getting to the point now where it's potentially quite a dangerous number for various reasons. And we really have to think about, okay, how do we engage with this idea? Because this is not going to go away with the now annual rather than every 5 years invitation for countries to submit their targets. 1.5 is going to come up again and again and again, a bit of a buzzword. And there's a couple of things we need to think about when we're engaging with that at a community level. The first thing is, as I'm sure we all know, it's really not a safety net, and it's very easy to slip into that language as something we're aiming for. Obviously, there's a lot of data around how above 1.5 degrees we're looking at catastrophic impacts, but already at 1.1, 1.2 we are seeing huge changes around the world, and every single fraction of a degree between hitting 1.5 and above 1.5 will bring new consequences as well. So this is not a target, and it's not something we should view as a safety net, and it's really important to engage in that language. And the second thing is, as with a lot of this science, it's based on uncertainty. You might be able to see under the temperatures on this graph, there's a temperature range which represents the degree of uncertainty within that in terms of the scientific consensus. So even 1.8 degrees, there's a range underneath that between 1.5 and 2.4. So there is a lot of uncertainty. It's the best data we have, but it is not an exact science. It's a model, it's a projection. So we really need to think about what is our relationship with this number, 1.5. A second thing that's really important at a community level and how we go forward is climate adaptation. So not just mitigation, not just how do we reduce our emissions, but how do we respond to the changes that are already locked in. Now, there was more talk about adaptation at this COP than there have been at previous ones, but still not very much at all. And most of it focused, quite rightly, in the global south and countries that are already experiencing huge impacts. But we do need to talk about what is happening at a local level. And we're at the stage now where the data that we have is far outstripping the policies, the strategies, the plans that we have in place to address those. I've just looked at Truro as examples. That's where I live, down in Cornwall, and looked at, okay, what's the data available? Here's a map that's looking at area of Truro that will be under the annual flood limit by 2040. And what we find is, when we show people maps like this, the first thing they do is look at, where's my house? Where do I live? And it's totally understandable. But we also need to ask the questions around, okay, well, where is your hospital? How do you get to work? Where does your food come from? And how does this impact those things? We have the data. What we need to do is add in the stories of how is this going to impact how people live in this community. A couple of other examples. This is some data that we have at the University of Exeter working with the Met Office. Again, looking at Truro, what I've just looked at as an example. The top graph is looking at how the average temperature is going to increase over the decades in the summer and the winter. So we can see a considerable increase, which will bring heat waves that will have impact on health and various other aspects of our lives. The bottom graph is looking at rainfall. So the trend here is for wetter winters and drier summers. Wetter winters will bring more mold and damp in our houses. It will affect how we travel. Drier summers will affect how we grow food, what happens in terms of tourism. So we really need to use this data that is available at an academic level and bring that into communities and start telling the stories about how is this going to impact how we live our lives. And that's a real opportunity that isn't being done at a national joined up level yet. It's going to come. There will be support. There'll be resources for that. But right now, we need to start driving that narrative. Another really important point is around behavioural trends. First up, behaviour change. So this is what the national government is saying around behaviour change at the moment in terms of COP and in the net zero strategy. It wants to go with the grain of existing behaviour and trends. Expecting the British public to forego holidays abroad would be an enormous political challenge. What we're seeing here is a delegation of responsibility around behaviour change. This is not something the UK government wants to take on. It wants a painless transition. It doesn't want to be responsible for the sacrifices that we know are necessary. But obviously, we know there are only sacrifices to perpetuate a planet that can have life on it. So it's not really a sacrifice, but obviously working in those shorter political timeframes does have a cost. So the onus is on us at a local level. We have to be driving behaviour change because it's not happening from above. And there's one thing from this graph, which is some data around asking people what personal efforts would you be willing to make. And the highest number that was agreed with was the comment, I would accept stricter rules and environmental regulations. 76% people say that, 76%. But that's exactly the kind of behaviour change from top down that we are not seeing from a governmental level, across various parties. And so that is falling to us. It's a complex issue, but one we are going to have to really engage with. Global framing is another one. And what I effectively mean by this is, who can we blame for climate change? Can we blame China? Can we blame India? A lot of the language coming out of COP, these are some newspaper headlines, The Sun talking about China, Russia, India, The Guardian quoting Alok Sharma's frustration at India and China. And not only are these comments and this language, deeply rooted in colonialism, in racism, they're also, they don't stand up to scrutiny. Every country has its own barriers in how it addresses climate change. But they're not new messages. This is a cartoon from 2015, effectively blaming India for getting in the way of progress. And as climate change becomes more and more dominant in general discussion, these are the messages that are out there at the moment. And these are the messages we have to counteract and be aware of. Who are people going to blame? And what are the impacts of that going to be at a local level? This increase of division and racist terminologies. Loss and damage is a really important thing. I'm hoping my co-speakers will talk more about this. But this is something that really came out of COP quite strongly. And this idea of it being the third pillar of international climate policy. So mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. How do we address the impacts that have already occurred and are largely coming from inequity at a global scale? This is an interesting quotation, I think, from Mohamed Addo from Power Shift Africa. Loss and damage is now up the political agenda in a way it was never before, and the only way out is for it to be eventually delivered. So there's some optimism in this. It's not saying that this was good enough and what happened at COP26 was what needed to happen, but it is talking about trends and the fact that loss and damage was more than ever before a campaigning point, a protest point, and this wouldn't have happened a few years ago. And this is directly linked to things like the acceptance of the science, the fact that we can say these things without people denying that it's actually happening. Now it's just denying that it's our fault and we should do anything about it. So that it is shifting. This is a line in the sand that is moving forward. And this is something we shouldn't necessarily celebrate or think is good enough, but it's something we should recognize and build on. So to wrap up, there's a few key things that I think are really important for us in terms of how we move forward from COP. The first thing is we really need to focus on what happened, recognize that, understand it. Again, not champion it, not say that it was enough, but to use it to accelerate forward, because all of the science suggests we have to accelerate. But the good thing about acceleration is it doesn't have to happen in a straight line. We're doing some really interesting research at the University of Exeter around positive tipping points. So looking at how does positive change happen all of a sudden when the conditions are created in the right way. We can look at it in terms of renewable energies or biodiversity restoration, but how does change happen not in a straight line? And this is something we can really look at a local level and notice the potential for these positive tipping points. So for example, focusing on behavior change doesn't change in a straight line. It can happen all of a sudden. You get that critical mass and then things change almost overnight. And we have to recognize those lines in the sand that we're not going to go back from, whether it's about fossil fuels being a toxic asset, whether it's about loss and damage being in the way people talk about the climate emergency now. These are the things we have to recognize, not let go of, and push forward from. Thirdly, we really need to talk more about climate adaptation. and think about how are our communities going to be affected, both directly in terms of the direct impact of a changing climate, and indirectly in terms of how the systems that we live within that govern our lives, how are they going to be changed? These are the stories we need to be telling, and these are the things that we can start using different narratives, different ideas, different ways to engage people. Fourth point is we should use academics more, and I don't just mean the University of Exeter. There's academic institutions with amazing data, amazing research all around the country, all around the world, and more academics are wanting to work with people who are doing stuff on the ground, not waiting for national leadership to get together and make something happen. Work with people who are doing stuff right now to use those. And lastly, we need to recognize that change is happening. It's not enough. It's not happening quickly enough. But what we need to do is to start acting as though the next changes that are coming are inevitable, because they absolutely are. We just haven't yet got to the point where the political will lines up with the technological capability and the scientific knowledge, but that is coming, and we need to really act as though that is here now, because we are living in a post-COP26 world, and right now it's not necessarily clear what that actually means, but it will do in time. The key thing is that we start thinking about, right, how has the world changed and how do we respond to that? And I think that's the really key question to take away from COP26.
We're now going to hear from two speakers who were both in Glasgow, both doing very different things, both with a unique angle on what they saw, experienced, and felt. We're going to start with writer and artist Lucy Neal. Lucy has a background in theatre, initiating and co-directing the London International Theatre Festival. I'm sure that must be Festival of Theatre, 81 to 2005. She's been active in the transition movement since 2008, and her fantastic practical handbook, Playing for Time, Making Art as If the World Mattered, maps an aesthetic of care with 60 artists and grassroots activists reimagining our world at a time of loss and planetary uncertainty. She's currently engaged with Walking Forest, a 10-year artwork inspired by forest ecology, hidden stories, and women's activism in defense of the earth. She's a founder declarer of Culture Declares Emergency, and she lives in Tooting, where she swims all year round in Tooting Beck Lido. Lucy, the next 10 minutes is yours.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm just a little bit intimidated, but I'm going to attempt to tell quite a personal story, really, in relation to both COP and community, sort of weaving together two narratives of my life and work as a creative practitioner, as a professional artist, and as a community activist. And my sort of mantra since I first came across transition was Gary Snyder, find your place on the planet, dig in and take responsibility from there. And my sort of place on the planet is very much Tooting, where I live in southwest London. And I will, in a few minutes, come to that. But I've been asked tonight to talk about COP. I was in Glasgow for about 8 or 9 days, and it was very intense. I just by chance, actually, Professor Tim Lenton from Exeter University yesterday, he referred to COP saying, all the tipping points that were talked about, which were climactic, were really, really bad. But he said, actually, all the tipping points that were social were good. And I really had that feeling, and I wasn't in any of the talks. Obviously, I was just on the street being a creative activist, but you did have that feeling that the social tipping points, that was something completely unstoppable about so many people reconfiguring the world and addressing that. In terms of going there in a line of sight, I'm going to tell you a little about Walking Forest, which is what took me there. But we were very much, in addition to Walking Forest, part of Farhana Yamin, who's a climate lawyer. We were sort of very much in her team up there. And she helpfully said things like community is the new COP. And her narrative that she was trying to build up there was around loss and damage, having been to so many COPs herself, and what she called the justice narrative, and about fairness, about the countries that had done least suffering the most, and the countries doing the most damage suffering the least, in a sense. So that was kind of, the journey that we went up there. And I'm now going to share my screen and tell you about Walking Forest. Is that something that you can see? I hope you can. So this, as Rob has said, is a 10-year project with Ruth Benthoven, Anne-Marie Culhane, Shelley Castle and myself, inspired by both past, present, future activism of women and learning about forest ecology and what it is and how we stand up for the things that matter. So very inspired by past movements of change. Here we have 4 suffragettes, and we were very thrilled to discover over 100 years ago that they planted an arboretum. And we were looking at these connections between movements of women leading change and where those connected with the natural world. And one of the questions we asked ourselves is, you know, if some of these amazing women were around today, what is it that they would be standing up for? And also we were very inspired by the idea of what is hidden and what are the stories we haven't heard and how do they connect? And also, you know, the energy of the forest floor is hidden, it's underground, it's the mycelium, it's these incredible networks linking and feeding and nourishing each other. And one particular hidden story that we came across quite quickly in the Walking Forest work was the Arboretum itself, tragically, was completely demolished in the 1960s. But the woman with the spade in her hand is a Wimbledon suffragette called Rose Lamartine Yates. And this is Rose with Annie Kenny, who's quite a well-known suffragette, planting a black pine tree. And when Rose had her foot on that spade planting that tree, she was a young mother. She couldn't have possibly known at that time what it was that she, you know, how the campaign, which was the votes for women and equal franchise, what would happen in time in a life that she, you know, she would not necessarily be around to see the mature tree, which is now over 100 foot high, phenomenal, thriving black pine. It's in the home of a midwife, Eileen Paddock, in Bath Easton. And so part of Walking Forest was just to play with these ideas of standing up for change, and a project not exclusively to women, but led by women, in the understanding that women, there's a lot that women hold and carry between them, and how those connections of their lives and experiences work. So we've collected the pine trees and we have successfully propagated small saplings from Rose's pine. So Walking Forest is the story of 2 trees, and this is the first story of our first tree. Shelley Castle in the middle there, with myself and Fahani Amin, who I've mentioned, a climate lawyer. We travelled to the COP talks in Poland, in Katowice. We went by train, quite sort of openly, not quite sure what we would do other than this simple idea of gifting, taking the seed of Rose's tree and finding people to gift the seed to, in a hope that we would sort of somehow pass a seed of courage to them, in terms of the way that Rose had been brave in engaging with change making, but not quite knowing how it would find its way in the world. And on the very right is Salim Hook, who is a Bangladeshi scientist who's very, very a leader in the loss and damage story, and a leader in the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is 55 countries all, you know, on the forefront of climate change right now. And now we come to the second tree in our story, and which takes us up to Glasgow. Now, this is a beautiful birch tree growing in 1600 acre wood in Warwickshire. And it became part of our story when we were in Coventry this year, where we were resident as artists, as part of the City of Culture. So we could put a call out to women. What did they want to stand up for? Did they want to learn about forest ecology? And what between us might we make that drew attention to what it was we wanted to do to defend the earth and to stand up for the earth? So we held a camp in May and explored these narratives. And from our camp and from these remarkable women that we gathered together in Coventry, we began to devise between us a performance action that would take place in Coventry this autumn. Now, of course, working in Coventry and Warwickshire, it was almost inevitable that some of the women on our camp were very involved in the HS2 protest, which is just sort of tearing Warwickshire apart. Unbelievable destruction of ancient woodlands, oak trees, birch trees, chestnut trees, every kind of tree being kind of ripped up. So our silver birch was felled by HS2 and then became a sort of central part of our performance action in Coventry. And the idea that a group of women would carry a felled tree through the streets of Coventry became the sort of central part of the Coventry story. And we then worked together to co-design what we would wear, how we would carry the tree, how we would choreograph that, how we would be practical, aprons with pockets that would allow us to do this. And Alice, who was one of the women, I might actually ask, somebody to read this out, because my screen does something rather odd and I can't actually move my own face off the thing. So would anybody like to, Peter, would you mind just reading out what Alice says, if you can see it?
Yeah. We bear collective grief over the loss of the natural world, species, ancient woodlands, as women, as ancestors. We demonstrate courage and vulnerability, creating space for lament, but also inspiring hope, the feeling that we are not alone.
This was the sentiment, really, with which we set out from dawn to dusk on 2 days. This is a tree spirit and a tree guide, and those roles changed as we moved through from place to place in Coventry, asking the question, what needs to be spoken to, heard, listened under the canopy of a tree that has been felled and is carried by women? We took turns carrying the tree. It was heavy. We had to be very careful. And people spoke at different points around the city. This at the end of the first day, which very much marked a sense of loss, a sense of grief for the destruction of the earth. This is Lorraine, who spoke about being a migrant to the city, and about the migrant, that climate justice was going to be about migration and about the lives that were involved in that and that experience. The next day had a different feeling. It was more about the seeds of possibility. It was more about what could be done to reconfigure the world. Here we are drawing the names of women that gave us courage. We're in Millennium Square. Here we journeyed into the Lady Herbert Garden, one of the small garden areas inside the city of Coventry. I'm playing the role of tree guide here. And here for me was the most profound moment when a young woman from Coventry SAB spoke about the right for everybody to have access to green space. This had been a special garden place for her, the only green space that she had access to. And she really questioned about the rights of people to have access to green space if they were to feel that connection to the natural world. So we then concluded in Coventry. The little saplings that had been planted in May then got on the train with me and came up to Glasgow, where we sort of reconfigured the performance action. And again, we did a dawn to dusk. We called it an act of endurance and love for the planet, a cry for justice for future generations. And we did the same thing. We found a route. We met, this is going down a busy shopping centre, Buchanan Street. We came into places that had a history of protest in Glasgow. This is the old Judiciary Court, where we heard about extraordinary women, extraordinary protests. And again, we felt we were kind of coming in to the story of today, which again is about justice. It's about social justice, racial justice, climate justice, health justice, and what the loss and damage are calling justice reset. Here we met with Emma Hopkins and her bird action, looking and addressing the extinction of so many birds in our world. And again, this was a place of protest in Glasgow's history. But also we did our seed gifting again. Here were two instances. One on the top left, we gifted a seed in George Square, again, a remarkable place of protest in Glasgow's history. And the lady on the far left is Johanne MacLeod, who leads the Gal Gael and the Govan Declaration Free State, which I absolutely recommend. It set me on fire. I love the Govan Declaration of a Free State. And then Fahana had asked us into Scottish Power, where there was this remarkable gathering around loss and damage and how it would be funded. So there were many, many big foundations here, as well as people pushing. This is Assad Rehman from the War on Want and the COP26 coalition on the top right hand. And there's Anne-Marie, Ruth, Shelley and I with our gifting set. And that happens to be the director of the Bezos Earth Fund. And we were asked by Fahana to make this small personal gifting of the seed. And so I came away from COP and I read an article about how fundamentally important it was, the sort of people's COP, the climate justice. And this was a poem by Adrienne Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot say. so much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. So I'm now just going to come back to Tooting, as it were, and just
Lucy, just to say you're at 10 minutes. So
okay, so I'll just conclude here with my home base being Tooting, and this kind of extraordinary events that we've done in Tooting to kind of reconfigure the world, to reclaim public space, to kind of see what it would be that our future could hold amongst the community. Events like our carnival, like our celebration of wheels and the Tooting twirl, reclaiming a bus station and coming to this fish pond space. So these are the kind of events that we've held here, reclaiming the bus turning circle, making it a village green. And I just want to conclude on this one point here, which is this question of access to green space. This is a field in Tooting where we've asked the community and the council to reimagine it, keep the gates open, not locked. And can this be a green heart in the centre of Tooting where everyone has access to it? So for me, this is find your place on the planet, dig in and take responsibility from there. Thank you.
Lucy, fabulous as always. As Caitlin says in the chat, I could listen to Lucy all day long. I'm sure that would be a speak for everybody saying. And also, having been in Glasgow and been there when the walking forest arrived, it was really a very extraordinary, moving thing to walk along behind it and see how people in the city reacted and responded and how moved people were. Lucy, as always, fabulous. Thank you so much. And our second presenter is Ishaan Aggarwal, who is joining us today from India. Ishaan is an activist researcher, most recently based at Schumacher College in the UK, studying engaged ecology. He was an early founding member of the Extinction Rebellion India Hub and has been engaged with multiple climate justice movements, seeking to understand emerging narratives in the global north and those from legacy grassroots movements in the greater worlds. He was working at the COP26 coalition as the anti-oppression and well-being lead for the People's Summit, where they brought together voices that are hugely underrepresented and least heard in central climate discourses, while are in fact most impacted by the ecological crisis. He has an MSc in mathematics and previously worked as a capital markets trader in the Brazilian markets, finally moving away to live truly in embodiment of his values and in alignment with care-based economies. He's currently also an editor at degrowth.info. He's based mainly in Auroville in India, from where he joins us today. Ishaan, welcome, and we'd love to hear from your personal perspective and from the perspective of your work in the COP26 coalition, what you saw happening at COP26. What are the important moments you'd want to communicate? And from a COP26 coalition perspective, how did the coalition build solidarity between organizations? And crucially, how do we move forward as community activists beyond COP? Ishaan, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for that very generous introduction. My pronouns are he, him. I want to at the outset state how grateful I feel to be with you all here tonight. Grateful for this opportunity to be in presence. Why this technology remotely connecting me from a continent away. I'm from India, but I've been for the last 7 months in the UK. I also want to start by saying my deepest gratitude and a humble bow to all the cultures, elders, and from whom I learn and why I can speak today. COP26, I speak a bit to my observations, how different spaces perhaps convened and what we can draw out of it to move ahead as perhaps one united, diverse force. I'll mostly be speaking to you, no presentations, nothing. COP and all the discursive language around it, I realized this week, has shaped so much of my personal engagement through so many months now, more than I count. So without a doubt, observing all that had happened around COP26, I think me with a lot of conflicting emotions that needed time and space to attend to over the last couple of weeks. So it's such a time when I'm getting out of my mini hibernation. Sometimes I might feel incoherent, but yeah, I hope I can make next few minutes meet for all of you. I'm going to speak more about the emerging narratives and technicalities, which I think Peter spoke beautifully to. And by the end, hopefully leave you with some provocations and maybe some controversies. From a macro standpoint, I think so much of the rhetoric places a huge pressure on this 2-week window that we had for the COP to be as this critical time to determine the future and fate for humanity. I think this, in and of itself, is a broken narrative and really an offshoot of our current dominating paradigm, the colonized, core-oriented ways, as opposed to immersive, ongoing dialogue to seek pathways. So many countries showed up with commitments and pushed for plans they were anyway comfortable with or intending to make, which is a far cry from what we need in these times. Terms like greenwashing, tokenism, lack of frontline voices at those tables that unfortunately matter most were the theme of those 2 weeks. I remember a couple of years back when I logged into my first COP, which is happening in Madrid. I wasn't there in person then, but I tracked it on a bi-hourly basis almost. And I remember feeling disillusion and a lot of grief with no outlet or sufficient space. And feel only now 2 years do I have the word and language to say it, how it matured me perhaps in ways that I see COP. Because it hardened me to its reality. It perhaps prepared me for what was to this. The main COP was not the space we have changed. In a way, it seems as a military-style exercise where sharp words and numbers are used.
As I was saying, yeah, to zoom in a bit further now in Glasgow, I would say there were like two ends. At one end, I saw the humdrum, the two-toned UN zones, the blue and the more publicly green, suits walking in and out, jettisoned for the extravaganza from geographies far and wide. Ultimately, some on government-sponsored tourism, some select groups in the midst of this building those much better narratives, and some there in Glasgow to really fight for the last waking breaths of the communities. But ultimately, all of them caught in the web of corporate elitism, hierarchy, exclusivity, and that paradigm serving to political gamesmanship, where each one tries to eke out the best deals for the badges and flags they represent. So what could have been a treasure of collective intentions, solidarity, and consolidating those pathways in this, the 11th hour for humanity, turned out to be the proverbial burial of lives, present and future, due to long arrested imaginations. But at the other end, where perhaps I was posted, was this mosaic of civil society groups. They came together in multiple spaces around the city, keeping an eye out on what was coming out of the central negotiations, but definitely focused on charting the narratives that we also desperately need. In the 2 weeks, I saw a rainbow coalition emerge, truly people's imaginations. And as part of being the People's Summit, one small part of the People's, I met more people in those 2 weeks than I probably met in the 6 months in UK. So much for being in it. Well, it's hard to do this though, in all fairness, because with all these rich collectives and those curiosities, stories, reflections, and imaginations, we could convene together, we could convene better, serve better, and imagine how can we empower a better humanity around us. With the coalition, our main focus was to provide spaces for voices that are less heard and underrepresented, and chart our ways out of there. Over the years, there's definitely been an increase in awareness, but has that translated in an elevation of collective consciousness? It depends how you define it, maybe. But for me, that rise is rooted in the entanglements with the wisdom of peoples with different abilities and wisdoms of ancient cultures that today still practice those methods and ways in different corners of the world. The wisdom that hasn't come enough to the fore in these centralized discussions. Science, so rich, too often has been the tool of the master to curtail enough action and enough connection. And so we need to turn that approach on its head sometimes, perhaps. So in our attempt at the coalition, we deliberately themed panels and movement assemblies through those 2 weeks in an attempt to disrupt the status quo and provide these spaces, hold people in these spaces, immerse with them, engage, emote, cry, hug, unravel, get back together, raise hands in the airs with feet firmly planted on the ground beneath. It was an experiment, dare I say, where we all lived some utopia collectively for those brief moments. But we also failed on multiple counts. I was privy to so many of them. And that makes me think, failure is a gift that you're looking for right now, because that is what, brings in that humility and that churning. There is no correct ways. There is definitely no one correct way. Oftentimes the spacers headlines with numbers that rhyme with 1.5, 2050 and the proverbial net zero. But we also need to look past that. I have a background in math and finance, but I have that love for numbers. And I've also seen how those numbers are manipulated to suit different narratives by the established hierarchies. But what gives us hope are better stories. And the environment movement that's often been caught in these games of fighting for 1.5 or making sure that we draw down all net zero by 2030 or 2050, etc. I think is a interesting kind of trap sometimes. But it's so a part of storytelling and collective making that we forge bonds and develop trust. In our words, of intentful love translating into action and not vacuous numbers, allowing us to not live into certain imaginaries. In those 2 weeks, I saw whistle glimpses of that in places like the Adelaide Place, where we had people discussing and debating a People's Green New Deal. I learned from struggles of people fighting for gender justice, heard the silencing that has been felt by disabled people for years and years now, even in social movements, felt the calls by the indigenous people to come and stand with them and also protect them, for they've protected our ecosystems in the shadows for decades, whilst we consume them and profit out of them. The youth movements are given space and we evoked a sense of intergenerational justice. And the scaffolding to all of this was language justice. How do we reach out to more people in their language and not the colonizers' language all the time? In the context of India, I felt that was one of the biggest takeaways. So in a sense, we need a diversity of tactics. The largest mobilization in the modern times, the farmer protests in India, which just recently concluded, subverted the authoritarian laws, not on the back of graphs and plots and PowerPoint presentations, but on the back-breaking struggles of women and all persons in the harshest weathers of Delhi, year-long standing in resistance. So there's a lot for the North to learn from the legacy struggles of the larger global South world, not least against the colonizers from here, but also what's happening at this very moment and how to engage to build better futures. So in totality, what I'm trying to say is perhaps that these times call for radical movement of movements. We need to stretch our tent as big as possible and be more inclusive. Sit with people that do not think like us and sip our teas to create the solidarity. Share our food and homes with them and struggle with them. Make sense of our own privilege and decolonize our already well-intentioned actions, but now construct our movements through those pathways. I'll just finish by saying this word dwelling, which I've been thinking of for the last 2 days, because a friend is doing a dissertation on that. And so I've been dwelling for a world that needs togetherness and not separation, dwelling in that love of community and not suspicion of each other. And how can we shape a world filled with these kind of imaginations and dwellings, and through that, repair our broken world? Thank you.
Wow, Ishaan, thank you so much. Fabulous. So much from both of our speakers there to digest and reflect on. This now is your question time, and whatever the most burning questions are that you would like to explore with our fantastic hosts, we're going to take a couple of minutes for you to use the chat to post your questions. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask each of our three guests if they might have a reflection on something from what they heard from the other two guests, the other two speakers, that particularly moved them or touched them or inspired them or surprised them, just a standout from each of the two other speakers. And then we're going to come back to hear some questions. So, Peter, maybe we'll start with you. What would be your reflections on what you heard from the other two speakers?
I think the things for me were around stories and narratives. I really liked how Lucy told, kind of weaved an old story into a new story, and that really resonated with me, and the potential for doing that in our communities. And I felt that Ishaan kind of brought that idea of stories on, further talking about the hope in stories, but also about the kind of the potential danger in stories as well, to kind of limit our understanding of science and data and numbers, and the kind of the caution we need to bring to that. I think those are the ideas that really resonate for me.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Lucy, what would be your standouts?
Well, I loved what Ishaan said about this, the radical movement of movements, because I think just to really trust that there is a radical move, and there is, but actually to know that you've got the wind at your back and that you can be part of that. I just think it gives us all a bolder, braver sense of the changes that we can make. And we have to do a lot of it just not knowing fully the whole picture. We just have to do it emergently. And from Peter, I was just grateful, because sometimes we go down into our own little stories, our own little actions. And I just appreciated Peter's overview and gaining that real clarity of the steps, not to overlook the changes that have happened, and not to be, to use those as our own accelerator, rather than fearing what hasn't happened, which we can get a bit lost in that.
Thank you. And Ishaan, what would be your reflections?
I definitely remember being very moved by how Amal was, gifted a seed from a black pine planted by suffragette over 100 years ago. That definitely, felt really deep in me. And I remember that from the streets of Glasgow, and also when Lucy kind of briefed on that a bit right now. So yeah, I mean, just that kind of immersive, feeling is there. And with Peter, of the clarity and those real important points through science that tell us what to do and what not to. I think I carry that.
Thank you. So we have some questions, and I'm going to pick a few of these. So the first question is from Camille in Southend in Transition, who asks a question that I hear a lot when I go to visit transition groups. He says, how do we reach out to new people outside of our circles while our personal lives are saturated or fragile already? Lucy, maybe we'll start with you. How best to reach to new people beyond our circles, do you think?
Well, I think I sort of had a general point about sometimes when you simply commit to a story or a line of action. I mean, our example of carrying a felled tree through the streets. I don't recommend everybody does that, because it's actually quite heavy and quite hard work. But it's this thing that sometimes when you commit to an action, you sort of go down, you kind of make connections almost sort of beneath the surface, rather than immediately connecting with the people. I mean, I just give one bizarre occurrence when we were in Glasgow, when two policemen, who we were rather dreading the police, but two policemen came up to us, and one of them said, I know that tree. because he happened to be in Coventry when we were there. Now, we didn't seek to influence the police in Glasgow, but there was a kind of serendipity to that connection, and all we were doing was telling our story. This isn't a very accurate answer to the question, but it's that thing about sometimes when you go down and deep, you kind of connect across in ways that are rather surprising and serendipitous.
Thank you, thank you. I spoke to that policeman. He was very moved by the whole experience, I think. Ishaan. You're muted, I think, Ishaan.
Yeah. Audible from
The signal is very, very bad.
Audible better. Oh no.
Try again. Try again.
Am I audible now? No.
No, it's not great. Peter, maybe we'll go to you and then see if maybe if there's anything Ishaan can do. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's an important question. There isn't an easy answer. I think two things for me. One is that we have to make sure we don't hold shame with ourselves and guilt when we ask this question. There's always more that we can do in theory, but it is really hard. There is no right way to do it, and I think we do have to be careful that we don't blame ourselves for not being able to get everybody in the room, virtual or otherwise. But I think the thing for me is again, it's around what can we do differently, and acknowledging that the way we think or expect change to happen and change to come is not necessarily the way it will come. And again, this idea of positive tipping points, of change doesn't happen in a straight line. You're not going to see people change their behavior, like on a graph. You can't always see what's happening beneath the surface, but if you can focus on cultivating the right conditions for new people to come to this in their own way, then it will happen. But we have to let go a little bit of that control, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Ishaan, can we hear you now?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, that's much better. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, amazing. All right. Yeah, how do we build or reach out to more people and build communities when our own kind of personal lives might be a little fragile or uncertain? I think for me, it's definitely about creating interest-based communities locally, if at least we're trying to do that. Engaging in conversation with people around the things that they care for most, and through that and via that, creating those bonds of solidarity and then kinship through which we can communicate much larger crisis maybe down the line. I feel it's a slow, immersive way to kind of forge those communities. And like Peter said, it's not linear. It's cyclical and parallel kind of ways of immersing together. So I think for me, it's about a real immersive community building and having those conversations cyclically.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have a question. Of course, the conversation about what do we do next and what does our activism look like covers the whole range of what that might mean and what that might look like. So Duncan Smead asks, does disruptive action like the recent Insulate Britain blocking of the M25 have any real benefit? That's a big question. Peter, maybe you could start us with that one.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's not a binary thing. It has brought something to the conversation that was, grossly under or kind of misunderstood or not engaged with correctly. And I think for me, it brings out the kind of the dissonance and the irrationality in how we framed, or not necessarily we, but how it is framed sometimes. You think about the disruption that Insulate Britain protest caused and the blame that was apportioned to that. And then, same kind of time period, the M25 was shut for flooding. And who were people blaming for that? I didn't see anything really pointing, oh, well, this is the fault of, fossil fuel companies or anything like that. So again, it's, you know, that narrative, and it's very easy to get sucked into the kind of the simple narrative, but I think actions like that do bring to the surface the irrationality in the way our society holds these ideas.
Thank you. Ishaan, I took that as a seal of approval from you there.
I think you already know that I support or have engaged in conversations around Ishaan Britain. So personally, I definitely believe in a diversity of tactics portfolio of actions, right? And I think Ishaan Britain, even though it might not be the cup of tea for a lot of activists, and even people who believe in civil disobedience, are able to perhaps move the curve a little more radically, as might be required right now, especially post-COP, when we've seen the established hierarchy delay on actions and delay on their promises. So, I mean, it's not how the climate movement needs to be only, but it's one very important, I feel personally, one very important a part of the diversity of tactics that we need to be really supporting and being solidarity with those activists.
Thank you very much. And Lucy, what's your thoughts on that?
I'll be really honest that imaginatively, the Insulate Britain action didn't capture my imagination. I mean, creatively, I couldn't quite make the connection between blocking the M25 and albeit important, insulating our homes. However, one of the women in Coventry, and so I frankly, because so busy, I wasn't really paying it a great deal of attention and kind of working it out for myself as an action. But one of our women in Coventry was very, very involved. So she actually kind of kept disappearing from our rehearsals because she was blocking the M25. And because I respected her, and because I was very kind of beholden to her for some of the work that she was doing, I did then start to kind of pay it more attention. And I was very humbled myself in terms of following her personal story through it. And it made me think more about actually why they did that and how they did that, and both kind of terrifying, and also now the support for the 9 that are now in prison. Whatever view you have of that action, those 9 people, they should not be doing custodial sentences in prison at the moment. And I hope a lot of other people are thinking about that as well.
Thank you. I've just realized that actually what I didn't do was to ask the people who wrote the questions to ask the questions themselves, which is always a nice thing to do. So I'm going to ask Cara Naden from Somerset to ask a question. Cara, are you there?
Hello, Rob. Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. Hi. This is great. I'm really enjoying being here with everyone. So thank you very much. My question is, what does success look like and how do we get there?
There's a nice, easy question there for us. Lucy, what does success look like and how might we get there?
Well, I'm just going to say my experience really of the last kind of few months of doing Walking Forest, which was a new experience for me, which was that the space we held in Walking Forest was to allow for a really honest holding of despair and a sort of ritualized sense of grief and mourning, and holding that in the public realm. And this is a bit of a thing for me, is that I think change happens in the public realm, and the more we engage with the public realm, but in holding that space for people to truly acknowledge what it is that we're losing and to feel the depth of that grief. Surprisingly great joy comes from that. And the joy comes from the sense of connection we have when we meet and hold other people in that space and we find ourselves enacting that story. That is where the really deep sense of connection comes from. And then we connect with people that we've never met before. We connect with strangers. We connect deeply at an unbelievably deep level about a knowledge about what it is to be a people, to be human, to be part of the natural world. And that gives us great joy, and that gives us the seeds of courage. So success for me would be to find a way in our personal lives to be able to balance that acknowledging of loss whilst building on the joy that makes the space for life to be lived fully and for us all to flourish as we know that we can. That's for me what success feels like rather than looks like.
Beautiful. Thank you. Ishaan, what does success look or feel like for you, other than having really great Wi-Fi?
For now, just great Wi-Fi. But it's such a simple and philosophical question. In the context of the climate justice movement, it's hard to, I think, fully visualize success. I think there's so many different levers, and I say that success in the short term maybe would be how can we be more inclusive? How can we grow our tent to as many people as possible, grow it wider and longer and deeper, and get all those voices that have been less heard for decades? And in a long term, being able to kind of avert societal collapse, because that is where we're headed.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you don't bad enough.
Thank you. And Peter.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have a big vision of what success looks like, but I think I have lots of little parts of that vision. Things like what I heard in what Lucy was saying around weaving old stories into new stories, in more self-acceptance on a personal and collective level. And I have lots of little things like that are only parts of the vision. But I think one of the things that I really like is that we don't have to have the whole picture, because I know the other bits are going to be filled in by other people. And it's sometimes quite hard to kind of hold that. And when there are times when you really need to see what that vision looks like. But I think it's important to kind of recognize the gaps in it and create space for them to be filled by others.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask Ruth from the Climate Emergency Centre Network if she might like to ask her question. Ruth, are you there?
Oh, yeah. So, yes, my question was, so we've got all of the disruptive action happening, which is disrupting the old system, which we need to go. Well, it's going to go anyway. The planet will force it, or we'll get rid of it. It's going to be one or the other. It's going. It's disrupting the old system, but for people to kind of engage with that, they're going to get triggered by the old system going if they haven't got something to move to. We're part of building the new. That's what we need to be doing. And we haven't got enough of a new vision happening yet that people can go, and move to that. So what's happening is they're getting disruptive action and they're getting the fear triggered and they're not seeing anything else. So what do we do? How do we build a vision that people is real and is practical and is accessible for people to move into? Because that's what we need to do. That's our part of the story.
Beautiful. And I'm going to set our guests the particular challenge of trying to do that in under a minute, because we're running quite tight on time. So Peter, what would be your thoughts on that?
But yeah, great. The building the vision thing, I think for me, it is, again, it's not about one vision. It's about what are the questions we're asking to get that vision. And everybody might have a different one, but if we're asking the same questions, I think that's a really good start. I think it's one of the things I really like about the donor economics model, and getting us to think about what are the questions we would want to ask to have a thriving community, a thriving planet. What questions can we answer and what questions can we not? And I think that for me is where I find hope.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ishaan.
Yeah, I was having a very similar answer to Peter right now, actually. I think one of the things that we don't speak of enough at these central kind of climate action conferences is about the alternative economics and how that is a keystone piece for any kind of climate restoration. I would say something similar to what Peter was saying around donor economics, actually, and degrowth.
Thank you. And lastly, Lucy.
Oh my goodness, I'm feeling a bit drunk with all these very big questions, actually. But I think my answer would have to be play. I think things have to be fun. And I think in a really simple way, we can make things together, and just using our hands, having really tangible things that we're coming together to create together. I think the joy of that, the pleasure of that, of connecting with people, of feeling part of something, of knowing what the story is and your part in enacting that story. I think that's where we grow our sense of our capacities for action. And I think we will get our new stories, and I think we will get that sort of sense of a reality to some of the things that we're dreaming about. It'll come, in the valley of their making, as it were. And I think that's just immensely doable. And, whether it's a restart party or whatever it is, these are really profoundly important ways in which we grow our sense of capacity for action.
Thank you, all three of you, and everybody, for your questions. And we're going to put a stop on the Q&A now, because we're near to time, and we wanted a little shift of energy before we draw this wonderful webinar to a close. We've spent a lot of time talking about actions, but we want to just make a little space now for the question of how to sustain ourselves. This evening has been, I think, quite moving, maybe little moments of despair, moments that might have allowed you to see new possibilities, reasons for hope and determination, and an emotional soup. So we wanted to just offer a 1 minute moment of silent reflection, just to let things land in you, just to take a breath. So we're just going to take a minute in silence, and then I'm going to just come back and ask you to do something. So we'll take a minute now. Thank you very much. Thank you. And we'd like to ask if you might just use the chat, if there's anything you'd like to share, which is things that you find are really good for sustaining you in this work. What sustains you? What would you like to share with people? Your thoughts on how best to sustain ourselves going forward? Any tips, any words of wisdom, any advice, any gems you might like to share? And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask our guests as well if they might have things they'd like to share. Lucy, what would be one thing that you find really sustaining in the work that you do?
I think we all suffer from imposter syndrome somewhere. We're saying to ourselves, I'm not this, or I'm not creative, or I'm not an activist, or I'm, and I just think that the wind is at our back now, and we are those things, and we are imaginative, and we are collectively capable of doing things beyond our wildest dream. And it's not only us doing it. So there's a lot that you can trust in providence, trust the universe will come to meet you when you make that bold step. Try it out now.
Ishaan, thank you, Lucy. Ishaan?
All right. Yeah, I think it's been a lovely evening, and thank you for this. I think some of my parting thoughts in a way are around, movement building and grassroots engagement, and engaging with people that we don't do often, who are sharing our own privilege and language and perhaps our own background, and really putting all these different conversations in the context of the damage that's happening right now in the wider world. So how do we really necessitate action right now on ground? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Peter, is there one thing that sustains you that you would share?
Yeah, silliness, I think, is the thing. There's so much absurdity and farce in the way that our leaders act that it can sometimes feel like a very serious thing. But I think sometimes we need to reclaim that absurdity, but in a joyful and a light and a silly way. I think that's really important.
Thank you, and thank everybody for your thoughts here in the chat. These will be to be digested afterwards, but just a little taste. Rebecca Solnit, amen to that. A walk in the woods, connections with other people, regular long walks, immersing in the sea, joy, being inspired by others, walk in lanes, woods, riversides. So yeah, thank you so much. There's a whole lot of a whole course in self-care just in this chat alone, which I would really recommend downloading. Hilary says swimming, as I'm sure would Lucy. Thank you all so much, everybody, for coming, for bringing your time and your focus. One thing I was asked to mention in terms of things we can do after, and we could spend a lot of time talking about what we can do after, and Rich just talked about one, but one is the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which is a really great thing to sign up and support. Needs a lot of moment, which is ceebill.uk. So our deepest thanks to Lucy, to Ishaan, to Peter for their wisdom and insight. And we look forward so much to seeing you the next time we do this. And certainly, as Rich said, for the next What Next Summit, which will be coming next year. Watch this space if you enjoyed the last one. Its sequel will blow your mind. So thanks to everybody and good luck. And we'll see you soon. And good night. Thank you.
You're welcome to pop off mute and say ta-ra, everybody. I love this cacophony. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Tremendous.
Bye.
Awesome. Bye.